Rapunzel, the story you know, that young girl with long golden hair locked in a tower. Sounds charming, doesn't it? But if you're ready to discover the dark version, let's open the doors of that tower and reveal the secrets it hides. In the original Brothers Grimm version, Rapunzel is not just a simple victim trapped by a witch. She is the result of a sinister deal. Rapunzel's mother was pregnant and suddenly developed an uncontrollable craving for a plant called rampion, which grew in the garden of a powerful witch. Her obsession was so intense that she believed she would die if she didn't eat the plant. Her husband, desperate to save her, broke into the witch's garden at night and stole the rampion. But, of course, nothing goes unpunished when it comes to ancient magic. The witch caught the man in the act, and instead of simply punishing him, she made a macabre proposition. They could have the plant, but in return, the child born would belong to her. And so, when Rapunzel was born, the dark deal was fulfilled. She was taken by the witch, not as a daughter, but as a prisoner of a pact of despair and misery. Rapunzel was never an ordinary child. She was a debt paid, a stolen soul. The tower where Rapunzel was imprisoned wasn't just a physical structure. It was a symbol of total control and isolation. No doors, no stairs, surrounded by a dense forest. The tower was the center of an eternal void. For Rapunzel, it wasn't just a stone prison, but a spiritual cell where the very notion of freedom became a distant, unattainable dream. Imagine living a life where the only contact with the outside world was the witch, the same one who imprisoned you, and occasionally, the sky seen through a high, unreachable window. The walls of the tower were like sentinels of time, turning each day into a torturous repetition of the previous one. As the years passed, Rapunzel's mind began to fragment. Each braid of her hair grew as an extension of her prison, wrapping around her psyche, enveloping her in a spiral of loneliness and despair. And then there was the call. Rapunzel, let down your hair. Every time the witch climbed her vast hair, the girl felt the weight of submission and hopelessness, as if her very essence was being drained with each visit. For Rapunzel, the tower wasn't just a physical prison, but a place of emotional and psychological torture. Every second there was a slow descent into madness. The prince, drawn by Rapunzel's enchanting voice, found the tower, and upon seeing the young woman, became obsessed. He climbed Rapunzel's long braids, night after night, without the witch knowing. The tale we're told suggests romantic innocence, but in reality, there was something darker in his visits. Rapunzel, naive and isolated, didn't understand the world beyond the tower. But soon, without realizing it, she began to change. The prince and she engaged in what could be described as a forbidden love, and this had terrible consequences. Rapunzel became pregnant, though she didn't understand what it meant. Her purity had been stained, not by love, but by ignorance. And in that time, such a sin couldn't go unnoticed. When Rapunzel noticed that her clothes no longer fit, she mentioned this to the witch, not understanding the reason. "My clothes are getting tight," she said innocently. The witch, however, immediately realized what had happened. Her creation had rebelled, breaking the purity she had imposed with her control. But to the witch, it wasn't just a physical transgression, it was a spiritual betrayal. The prince, with his selfish intentions and unchecked desire, had led Rapunzel to disgrace. It wasn't just love that guided him, but the urge to possess what should not be possessed. And Rapunzel, like an innocent lamb, was drawn into this sin without understanding the price she would pay for it. When the witch learned of Rapunzel's betrayal, her wrath went beyond any human limit. The tower, which had once served as a prison, became the stage for terrible revenge. Without any pity, the witch took a sharp pair of scissors and Ada, with a cold and calculated move, cut off Rapunzel's long golden braids, the very braids that had been her only connection to the outside world. But Rapunzel's pain didn't end there. The witch wasn't content with simply leaving her bald and vulnerable. She decided to banish Rapunzel to a remote desert, far from any civilization, where her punishment would be complete. Alone, pregnant, and helpless, Rapunzel was forced to face the vast expanse of sand and solitude, condemned to wander in an arid and unforgiving environment. The desert, for Rapunzel, was a slow death sentence, a punishment for breaking the sacred pact of her imprisonment. Meanwhile, the witch plotted one final blow for the prince. Using Rapunzel's severed braids, she set a cruel trap. When the prince returned to the tower, unaware of the fury that had been unleashed, he called for his beloved as he always did. "Rapunzel, let down your hair." And to his surprise, the braids were thrown from the window. As he climbed, expecting to find the sweet face of Rapunzel, he instead found the dark figure of the witch. Her eyes, filled with hatred, were mirrors of the hell she had prepared for him. Before the prince could react, the witch pushed him out of the tower window. The fall was long and cruel. On the ground below, he landed on sharp thorns, which pierced his eyes, blinding him forever. The witch's punishment was complete. Rapunzel was exiled to the desert, lost and isolated. The prince, now blind, wandered the world in despair, unable to find his beloved or even glimpse the light of day again. Both victims of their own choices and the witch's merciless hatred, Rapunzel, banished to the desert, wandered through an unforgiving landscape. The scorching heat and freezing nights surrounded her, and the wind blew like the whisper of eternal punishment. Pregnant and alone, each day was a battle for survival. The desert, with its empty vastness, was more than a physical place. For Rapunzel, it was a purgatory, a slow crossing between the world of the living and the dead, where her soul seemed as trapped as before, in the tower. Far from any human contact, Rapunzel was forced to give birth alone. There, in the barren sand, she brought twins into the world, a boy and a girl. The desert, as cruel as it was, now also became the stage for a new form of life. But existence there was not easy. Rapunzel struggled daily to find enough food and water to sustain her children. Each step she took in that endless vastness was accompanied by the memory of her loss and the witch's betrayal. The desert represented more than physical isolation. It reflected Rapunzel's spiritual loneliness. Here, her fate merged with that of other lost souls in the tradition of dark tales, where penance and suffering were seen as inevitable consequences of their actions. Time didn't pass normally. Rapunzel seemed to live an eternity of anguish, where her children were her only company, but also her greatest responsibility. The desert transformed Rapunzel. The naive girl of yesteryear was now a woman marked by suffering, hardened by the need to survive in a hostile environment. Each grain of sand was a cruel reminder of her exile, a prison without walls, but equally relentless. For years, she wandered in that desolate hell until, in a moment of destiny, something changed. A familiar figure approached, stumbling through the dunes. It was the prince, blind, wandering, condemned to roam the world after his fall. His blindness had condemned him to an endless search for Rapunzel, guided only by a vague memory of what once was. The prince, now blind, had transformed into a shadow of the man he once was. After his fall from the tower, he wandered aimlessly, guided only by the distant memory of Rapunzel and the echo of her voice in his thoughts. The blindness that afflicted him was more than a physical loss. It was a reflection of his guilt and the punishment imposed by his actions. He, like Rapunzel, was trapped in purgatory, doomed to wander the world without a certain destination, immersed in darkness. For years, the prince stumbled through forests, crossed rivers and deserts, always with the nearly extinguished hope of finding his beloved. His weakened body was a testimony to his pain. Despair grew with each step, but somewhere deep in his soul, the memory of Rapunzel kept him moving, even though he had no idea where she might be. And then, as an irony of fate, the two, now lost and transformed by suffering, finally reunited in the desert. The prince, blind and helpless, heard a distant sound, a voice that seemed to emerge from the depths of his memory. It was a sad and soft song, a melody he knew well. It was Rapunzel. Following the voice, he slowly approached, guided not by his sight, but by his memory and the echo of his hope. Rapunzel, upon seeing the debilitated man, barely recognized him at first. But when he approached and called her name, she knew it was him, the prince who had been responsible for her fall, but who also bore the same burden of suffering. In an act of compassion, Rapunzel wept upon seeing him in such a deplorable state, and her tears, falling on the prince's blind eyes, performed an unexpected miracle. His vision began to return, slowly, as if the very dark magic that had cursed them was, for a moment, allowing a glimpse of redemption. However, this reunion, though shrouded in a miracle, did not bring the expected relief. The desert still surrounded them, and both were marked by the scars of pain and loss. Their bodies were together again, but their souls were deeply broken by the lonely journeys they had endured. They could see each other, but they would never be the same. After the reunion in the desert, Rapunzel and the prince were together again, but suffering had left irreversible marks. The prince's restored vision seemed like a sign of hope. a miracle suggesting that their trials were finally over. However, the redemption they had hoped for was not so clear. The desert still surrounded them, vast and desolate, and the hardships of survival continued. Rapunzel, now the mother of 2 small children, was exhausted by the constant struggle for life. The prince, although he could see again, was no longer the brave young man he once was. He carried a deep guilt for having, albeit indirectly, caused Rapunzel's downfall. Both had been transformed by their suffering, and the innocence they once shared had been destroyed. The tears that restored the prince's sight also symbolized the mourning for what they had lost. They did not return to the state of happy lovers. The reality was much crueler. The world they once knew no longer existed for them. Their fates were irrevocably linked, but also stained by a darkness they could no longer ignore. Though together, they were forced to live in a sort of limbo, away from the world and the lives they might have had. The redemption Rapunzel brought to the prince, healing his blindness, was also a bitter reminder that they were doomed to carry the scars of their choices and circumstances. The happy ending many would expect became, in fact, a different kind of prison. A life of isolation and painful memories, where love and suffering coexisted inseparably. In the end, the fate of Rapunzel and the prince was not a fairy tale, but rather a narrative of survival and resilience in a world where suffering seemed endless. They had escaped from one tower, but had fallen into another, a prison of spirit and heart. And so, their lives continued, always in the shadow of pain, but also in a strange kind of peace. A peace made not of joy, but of the acceptance that the world, despite its cruelty, keeps turning. If you liked this dark version of the Rapunzel story, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more macabre stories like this one. This way, you won't miss any of the upcoming tales. See you next time.